A community that shares life together, shares joy together. Listen, we've been thinking about what it means to be the community of God's people, the church, and there's just something missing if we don't talk about joy. Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, and we've been working through Philippians, so we're not just picking up on this verse here at the end, but he says something that's really true of the whole thing. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Earlier in the first verse of this chapter, chapter 4, he says to the church there, he calls them his crown and his joy. Paul understands that a community of God's people should be rooted in the experience of joyfulness. We have much to celebrate. Now, it is true that we share other things too. We share difficulties and challenges. Sometimes we have conflict that we have to work through. And we, just as we celebrate with those who celebrate, we also mourn with those who mourn. And so it's not all giggles and laughter, but there ought to be some laughter. There ought to be places in our experience of church where we are filled with joy, where the community is fun to be with and we experience each other as blessing. Listen, from the very beginning, God's relationship with humanity was meant to be for our blessing and for our flourishing. And God has given us so much in this world so that we would have happiness in our souls. Now, it's not that our happiness is the most important thing in the universe, but God does care about it. And a holy happiness, a sacred joy that exists as God's people are devoted to serving Him together and are devoted to each other and serving each other and paying attention to each other's needs, that is a sacred thing. The church should ring with joy. And I want to say just a few things about joy this week and then offer it to you as a central practice of the church. The first is that joy is missional. What I mean by that is that it is impossible for us to fulfill our mission without some sense of joy. Listen, if we want to wrap other people into the story of Jesus and we want to invite them to be a part of our community, I mean, what do we think is going to happen if we go to them with an invitation that's all sternness and seriousness and never is able to appreciate with joyfulness the moment that we have? On the other hand, a community that radiates not fake joy, but authentic joy, that genuinely enjoys being with each other. That's a community that many, many people in our world are dying to be a part of. They long to be a part of. And I gotta say, I thank God for those people who have been a part of my journey in my life, who have made being a part of the community of God's people the great joy of my life. I have laughed so hard and I've shared such great friendship. And from the times I could remember going fishing with a bunch of youth group kids when I was in the 7th grade. And I remember my friend Dave Finn sticking his head under the water on this little pond we were in. We were in a little boat. He stuck his head under the water and he was yelling, "Come here, fishy, 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 fishy." It was ridiculous, okay? But you know what? I learned that the community of God's people ought to be able to play with each other. They ought to be able to have fun with each other. And it wasn't just Dave. It was also my friends Banks and Josh, or my friends Chad and Shannon, and my, many, many other friends that have been a part of my life that have walked with me. And the walking with each other after Jesus has been a road filled with laughter and joy, and that's really how it ought to be. Now, those moments of joy have sometimes been punctuated with sadness, and sometimes with conflict, and sometimes with things that we had to work out with each other. But there is joy in the making. And sometimes that's all that other stuff that we have to work through when we get on the other side of it, or maybe sometimes even in the middle of it. we find that because we are with our community, even in the midst of sadness, there is something that rings of joy in the middle of it. I bet many, many of you have experienced that exact same thing. And when we live that way, that's when we're at our best. And that's when we have the best message to offer to the world, not just the message of repentance, although that's important too, but a message that invites people that says, come, be a part of this community of free people, this community of saved people who celebrate what Jesus has done and what Jesus is now doing in the world. Listen, joy is missional. And when we practice it, we take great steps towards fulfilling what God has for us to do. But not only is joy missional, okay, but joy is infectious. And you know what? It really only takes like one or two people who are committed to living a lifestyle of joy. And sure enough, before long, it begins to spread through the whole community. Joy is something that is so easy to catch. And with just a little bit of intentionality, it can be something that spreads from one group to another group, from family to family, from person to person, all the way throughout the church. I wonder who it is that can show up at Cedar Lane committed to being a person that's going to spread some joy. You know, it might be you. You might be the person that helps unlock for us what it means to be a community of joy. You want to influence other people? If you really want to be an influence for other people, one of your best tools is your joyfulness. And the third thing that I want to say about joy is that it is habitual. Our keeping of joy is not just something that happens to us. It's a discipline. It's a practice. Actually, it's a lot of different practices, from the kinds of being aware of the kinds of things that rob our joy, like staying up too late and not getting enough sleep, or not feeding ourselves appropriately, or maybe just focusing too much on a lot of the negativity of the world, to some of those things that we can do right that help bring more joy into our lives, like a practice of counting our blessings and thinking with gratitude about the things that we've received that make our hearts swell with joy, to making sure that we carve out time in our schedules, not just for work, but also for friendship and for companionship and for play. All of those things are part of, as a whole, the practice, the discipline of joyfulness. Joyfulness takes work just as much as the other virtues, just like peacefulness or courage or love. Joy takes practice. It's something that we have to kind of arrange into our lives and build it. And so what I really want to say in this whole message is simply this: make space for joy. Make space for joy, because it can change your life if you can carve out some places for the practice of joyfulness. Pursue joy and practice joy, not just because it can change your life, but because it can spread through the community. And maybe your joyfulness and your intentional practice of joyfulness. And I'm not saying you're faking joyfulness or putting on a mask that pretends to be joyful, but the real cultivation of it in your life might be the sort of thing that spreads like fire throughout the whole community of God's people. Practice joyfulness, because it also can help us fulfill the mission of God better. It affects you. It affects your community. It can affect our whole neighborhood and our city and our world. We desperately need people of joy. And maybe now more than ever, right? As we've kind of done some of that work of, realizing some of the things that we've missed out on over the last few months, and maybe recognizing some of those things that we need to change about our world. And maybe we've thought about we've had some hard kind of stuff going on, right? You know what we really need to turn towards too? As we take all that stuff, as we take that true sense of gratitude with us, and as we take a sense of repentance and dedication to doing what's right in the world as best we can, We need people who can help us do it with joy. We need people who are practicing intentionally joyfulness. We need you in the joy that you bring to the table. And when we have that joy together, we are at our best as a community that shares life together. May God fill the church with holy, sacred joy. Amen.